we fail to see the deepest roots of our present failures, which have to do with the direction, goals, meaning, and social implications of technological and economic growth.
In Chapter 3 now, we are talking about the human roots of the ecological crisis. We're looking at what human beings do and have involved themselves in such patterns in the last 200 years that we have an environmental crisis. Now, we talked about what it was in Chapter 1, and secondly, we talked about the biblical backgrounds and our own theological background of what we as Christian people and people throughout the world in using their religious backgrounds, what these, how these affect what our answers that we will have, because we are actually in the process of doing. Now we look at what our last couple of hundred years have done to us, and we know that there has been a lot of change. And that's what you call technology. And there's railroads and the steam engine and the autos and airplanes, what even our grandparents and great-grandparents, areas which they never knew before. And yet we are doing these, using them, and in some ways they are changing our life in some way. They're not neutral. They have an effect upon us. And it's either for good or bad. And it's not that it's one or other. And therefore we see that sometimes if we do them in the worst sense, it can really hurt the balance of our own human beings, work, or it could hurt the world itself around us because we act in this world. And so we look at, we see that also there's biotechnology, there's nanotechnology, very small areas of technology which have really become extremely important in our age. And so all of this is what the Pope Francis tried to show in talking about creativity and power. That means that technology has a certain power and a dominion that we could actually influence us to a point of where we do actions which are for bad or good. And he brings up examples of the communist era, the Nazis, and how they had used technologies in their research and actions, and how that really affected human beings, killed people, and so forth. So we know that it can be used for good or bad, and the same thing can apply to the atomic age in which we live, and weaponry that was used, not by those countries that we mentioned, but by others in the Western world. Even the presence of the weapons today affect us in some way. So there's what you call a globalization of technology. It's all over the world. There's no areas, except for some very primitive tribes, that are without it, and they will probably be touched by it in just a matter of years. Nature is real. Its effect with human beings, there's a confrontation that's involved, is what the Pope talks about. And there's a concept of that many people have of unlimited growth, that as long as you have more technology, you're going to be better off. Well, we could be, or we could be worse off. And so that's what we have to really look at. And that's what he tries to say, when it's not neutral. And it's not just, he said, a question of trying to be beneficial to people or to make a profit for ourselves. There's also a deeper thing, and that is power. Technology gives us a sense of power, that we can be over others, whether people or nature itself. And that's what we brought up in the last talk on the chapter 2. That applies again, the respect that we must have for the technology that is a gift from God, or that can be used in a bad sense, and therefore we have to know what it is and be willing to confront it in some fashion. Finances are involved. Markets try very hard to use technology to their own advantage, and therefore we have to be ready for that in some fashion. We have to slow down. We have to consider things in their own fashion. We have to talk about co-ops and other areas of work where we use some of these technologies, and even appropriate technology, which is to use simpler forms to where the community is involved and controls the technology, not being controlled by an outside interest far away and tells you who's going to be employed and who's not and all of this, but rather it's something that we can use as a people and we can control at a local level or within our own communities. And so we have to talk about, to some degree, the better distribution of the wealth that is involved, so that this technology is not just an investment, a high investment, because some technologies are very expensive. It's not something from a distance, but it's something that human beings can use at the local level. And we'll see that in a minute, where it affects especially small farmers. There's a crisis then that we have. There can be no renewal of our relationship with nature without a renewal of humanity itself, is what the Pope says. We've got to be changing. We have to see that it's not a human-centered mastery over the world, and that exploitation that has been too much in the last several hundred years. Rather, we have to see that we have to have an I-thou relationship with our God, and in a certain sense, with nature itself, because we have to have that respect that shows that we are all part of a family together. And so we can talk about how it's been misused. We know in cases such as abortion, where they can actually take out a fetus and then use it for experimentation, and how horrifying this is for a lot of people. Well, this was brought up by the Pope, is that there is a crisis involved. And there's this practical, what he called, relativism. Now, when human beings place themselves at the center, they give absolute priority to immediate convenience, and all else becomes relative. That means people who are self-centered. And a self-centered world of, is it better for me? Well, that, without regard to what others are, well, that's the very part of where humans, when that attitude is present, can so easily misuse technology. The culture of relativism includes the power to force others to do certain things, to be indebted, because technology is involved many times buying things and being indebted. And therefore you're indebted as an enslaved people. You can't pay the debt. And don't believe it, that it's not something that's relevant today. It's very relevant. There's loads of people overloaded with debt. And part of that debt is because they're trying to keep up with the Joneses, and in trying to do so, they are using technologies which are expensive. Electronic devices, they have automobiles, planes, boats, name it, bigger homes. These all have technologies involved, and we become part of that culture that says, I need more of it in order to keep up with others. So there's an invisible forces at work here, and those invisible forces include a market that says, oh, it's the people who want it. Well, the question is, who made the people want it, except forces outside of themselves that cause them to take this or that new risk in their own lives. So the needs to protect people is extremely important, and the way in which they think and act, and knowing full well that it's almost countercultural today to think in terms of, let's be a little more simple about it, let's rest a little bit longer. He brings these points up, by the way, and let's try in some way to see that this work that we have is really something, a vocation from God. We have to be, in some ways, we have to be what the monks were of old. And that was, a slave can't work forever, day after day. And believe me, some people today are doing that, or they lose their job. And so the Holy Father brought this up. Pope Francis is talking about the proper nature of work, modification of the existing reality that we have, where some people, in order to earn a living, are almost semi-enslaved, and they do not have time off. The monks said that that was the reason why we had the feast and the festivals, was to allow the serf, or the person that was the lower end of labor order to always have enough time to celebrate, to rest, to think about things. And this is all part of a balance that's necessary in the world in which we live. So we're not just talking about what St. Francis held about creation, we're also talking about what St. Benedict had. And that was a proposed work and prayer being in modification, so that there's a balance involved. We work part-time, we pray part-time, we have time off. And that's part of the world in which we live. And I tell you, and we all know, that not everybody is balanced and has that ability. We know that business, that noble part of the vocation, can improve our world, and business still has to be under the controls of the people, the commons, and not individuals doing whatever they want with an area of work. We have to create jobs, that's true, but we can't dictate that this person works and does not work and others can take their place in modifications that have really affected the world in which we live today. We have to think of all the people and what they're doing and how it relates. Well, this is all part of, really, the technology of the world we live. But then let's go for a final area of that of biological technologies. And that, and the Pope says, is very complex, because we're talking about areas which can easily affect us in very great ways. Experimentation with animals. Well, he says, the church says, well, it can be done if it's for the betterment of people and it's done in a modified way, that you're not harming the animals too much. Of course, in some of them, in the experimentation, you have to. But that's rarely that we have that in which they are mistreated in any fashion. We don't want that to happen. So research can lead to a lot of the benefits that we need if it's biological. But at the same time, we have to consider all of the circumstances involved, and that's what makes it complex. And so we can talk about genetic modification, and we know that GM enters into a lot of the people's thinking. Is this product modified in some way that I do not want to use it? That's the question people ask at times. And then we think back and say, well, even the cereals that we have on the world today that's been domesticated, these have been modified by human action over the period of thousands of years, in fact. And so that's what makes it all the more complex. Some things that are GM modified are good, and some things can be very harmful. And so a small farmer who's trying hard to keep the seeds that he has in heritage ways and which he has his daily living, or hers, this can be so changed by the world of corporate agriculture around him that he's being forced, or she, to actually go out and move to a city. They can't do their work anymore. The Pope brings that up. And that's some of the final parts that he makes on this, because there's been great changes. Technology has brought them about. It's bringing them about and will in the future. So he says this is an area we've got to talk about if we're going to talk about the environmental crisis. And so that's the way he actually ends that chapter. Thank you.